And hi everyone, and we will start 5 minutes later because there are some problems with the traffic, and so we are waiting for some guests. And okay, 5 minutes. Thank you. So, hi everyone, and thank you for coming to this second day of the forum, Your Body is a Battleground. The title of the following panel is The Worldwide Networks of Ultra-Conservative Movements, and I welcome on the stage Annalisa Camilli, that will moderate the panel, Massimo Prearo, Katharina Ayak, and Elżbieta Korolczuk.
Welcome, good morning, thank you for coming, thank you for joining. Before starting this second day of studying and of discussing about the attacks worldwide against women's rights and the networking of these ultra-conservative movements, I would like to thank you, the organizers of this high-level discussion conference, because it is a topic that during the pandemic we have missed, we have forgive, but I think that now we should again focus on this, because it will influence the politics of our government and the future of our societies. I am Annalisa Camilli, I'm a journalist. I am working with the Italian news magazine Internazionale, and in the past few years we have worked in a network with other European journalists, also some German news magazine, like Tageszeitung or Austrian Falter, the French Libération. We have worked all together in order to study, to understand the strategies of ultra-conservative movements in our countries, the differences and the similarities, and their way of networking all around Europe and worldwide. But, first of all, the panel discussion will last 1 hour. Then it will be possible for you to address our panelists, our experts, with some questions at the end. We have some minutes for the questions. And then we will have 15 minutes break, and another panel discussion will start. But let's go to the point with our guest. First of all, I'm very happy to present Massimo Prearo, who is a political scientist, member and scientific coordinator of the research center Policy, Politics and Theories of Sexuality at the University of Verona. He has published a lot of books about anti-gender and the ideology of this ultra-conservative movement. I have interviewed Massimo during the Family Work Congress in Verona, because and I will start. I would like to start from this event, the World Congress of Family, because it was a very interesting event for journalists and experts and researchers, because it was the moment in which we could understand how this networking, this international network of ultra-conservative movement were organized, and which were the links, the financial links, the financial relations, and also the political and ideological basis of this movement. So please, Massimo Prearo, explain to us what we understood from this Congress and which are these ideological basis of their network.
Okay, thank you, Annalisa, and thank you, Asia, for the invitation. So let's start again from the 2019 World Congress of Families. As you said, for several days, the city of Verona, where I happen to work and live, I'm so lucky, was occupied by groups, organizations, and movements of different kinds: pro-life, traditionalists, radical Catholics, anti-gender, ultra-conservative, ultra-religious, neo-fascist, etc. However, it was also, Verona, the battlefield where feminist, trans-feminist, LGBTQI groups, organizations, and movements and their allies mobilized to challenge that occupation and to demonstrate against the Congress. In case you don't know, if not mentioned yet, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the World Congress of Families serves, I quote, as an umbrella for a massive network of interconnected organizations, all pushing for restrictions to LGBT rights under the guise of the natural family. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the World Congress of Families is a hate group. It is a dangerous group. And I would like to give you a quick taste of what I heard at this event and to show you who we are talking about. I would like to read a short quotation from the speech of Levan Vasadze, a Georgian businessman and scholar and politician, actually. Vasadze asked himself at the Congress 2 questions. The first one, what is ahead of us? And thus, what should we do? We, the World Congress of Families, of course. And he proposes, I quote, the contours of the alternative post-liberal ideologies. He says, we must replace the obsession with the so-called human rights by something much more traditional and acceptable by all human society. We have to write the world's first constitution based on the rights of a human family and on the obligation of a human being toward the society and toward the family. End of quotation. The second question, the strategic one, is why should we concern ourselves in the writing of such a thing in the absence of a country where it can be implemented? And he says, he replies, actually, it is the other way around. First, we develop an affirmative narrative of a post-liberal ideology, and then the course of history will guide us toward the countries which accept this. End of quotation. So, do not think that the World Congress of Families is only a meeting of unknown people, never heard before groups. As you may know, the event was also supported by several Italian ministers. Several politicians attended it, including Matteo Salvini. When I started observing anti-gender movements between 2013 and 2014, having meetings with NGOs, feminists, LGBTQI+ activists, there was a bit of this idea that such a project is so extreme and so out of step with the times, so contrary to the principles of liberal democracy, that it would simply be impossible to implement it or to concretize it. At the beginning, between 2013 and 2015, we were observing in Italy, in the streets, in the churches, in the parishes, these images of protesters, exclusively Catholics, a lot of neo-catechumenals, all members of religious groups or pro-life traditional movements, demonstrated against the bill on civil unions, against the bill against homophobia and transphobia, against the bill on gender education in school, and so on. When they first mobilized between July and August 2013 in Rome, they were a few dozen. In June 2015, 2 years later, always in Rome, they organized a big demonstration. They were about 400,000. Then the occasion of different electoral deadlines from 2016 onwards, they began to occupy the political arena as representatives of an oppressed people, of a majority reduced to silence, representative of a moral community, the same people populist parties and population address. In fact, these movements in Italy have occupied an empty space, a space left vacant by the death of the Catholic Party, the Democrazia Cristiana, but also left empty by the Church and the Italian Conference of Bishops. These movements so began to work in the field of party politics with the right-wing parties in this populist moment. And this has allowed them to obtain positions in a very short time. Here we see, on the top on the left, one of the protagonists, Senator Simone Pillon, who was elected in 2018 with the Lega, thanks to Salvini, who is a bit of a paradigmatic figure of this exchanging labor of resources between the movements and the parties, which has led to making these movements central actors in Italy in the public and the political debate. Also, because the issues on which these movements work today are on the agenda every day. They are not exceptional debates that occur once in a while. Every day, femicides, women's rights, discrimination, homophobia and transphobia, LGBT rights are on the agenda. And to do that, what they are doing is entering the institutions, you can see there, parliaments and local councils, to weigh in the debate, to play all the cards of democracy, to exploit the mechanisms and procedures of liberal democracy, to influence the discussion and change the course of events. It is not necessarily a question of going backward, not even only of restoring. I would say it is a question of changing the metrics of democracy with the very instruments of democracy. That is to say, of using democracy against itself. And I will conclude on that. In these days, in Rome, the candidate of the right and the center-right, not the marginal candidate with no chance of being elected, one of the main candidates has signed the political manifesto of the pro-life, anti-gender and pro-family movements, whose spokesman, the bearded one, you see there, not by chance, was also the vice president of the World Congress of Families in Verona, mentioned before. They are perhaps ultra-conservative, but in Italy, at least, they are now somehow the mainstream right wing. Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo. Prearo, it is very clear that anti-gender ideology is the key of this new ultra-conservative movement. And I would like to introduce the second guest, Katharina Ayak. She is a research associate and lecturer at the Department of Cultural Study in Koblenz, Landau. She was a research associate and lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. She has studied and researched a lot about these issues. I would like to ask you about the situation in Germany. In this country, you are in a campaign, an electoral campaign. How these groups are organized in Germany, and which are the relationship of this group with the political parties, the far-right political parties in Germany, and do they have a link, network with other groups in Europe and worldwide?
Okay, thank you, Annalisa, and also thank you again for organizing this event on this very timely topic. Before I start, at the beginning, I think it's important to mention that Maybe in contrast to other countries we are talking about, in Germany, when talking about right-wing populism and right-wing populist groups on the one hand and ultra-conservative groups on the other hand, we're not talking about two different groups. But in contrast, in the case of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, ultra-conservative policies and activists and networks have been part of this party from the beginning on, from the very founding moment. I think this is also often ignored in public and media discourse, which mostly focuses on more far-right ethno-nationalist tendencies like Björn Höcke, for instance. Yeah? But the best examples when talking about ultra-conservative policies within the populist right in Germany is, of course, you know her, Beatrix von Storch, who is the deputy leader of the AfD and the head of some very active, very important civil society networks in Germany and beyond. Such as the Zivile Koalition, the Civil Coalition, or the Initiative for the Protection of the Family, the Initiative Familienschutz, which, for instance, organized and financed the demonstration for all after the Manif pour tous from 2014 to 17 in several major German cities against sexual diversity education. And for instance, if you have a closer look at the election program of the AfD, you really find word-for-word formulations from ultra-conservative activists. I can come back to it later. So at the same time, these ultra-conservative groups, as integral part of the AfD, are, in my opinion, mainly responsible for articulating the gender and family policies of this party. So ultra-conservatives and right-wing groups are not congruent, yeah? But I think it's this right-wing populist complex, as Dietz and Roth calls it, we have to focus on when talking about ultra-conservative policies in Germany. So what are the main pillars of this right-wing ultra-conservative policy? Not surprisingly, the protection of the so-called traditional family, which is, of course, the married, heterosexual married white couple with its biological children. It should be strengthened both ideologically and financially, and of course, in the case of Germany, the lost fight against same-sex marriage. The opposition to gender mainstreaming, which is also kind of more of a chiffre, a buzzword, which also contains in these right-wing discourses the opposition to quota programs, to gender studies, to non-discriminatory language, or to sexual diversity education. And of course, one important point is to make access to abortion even more difficult in Germany. This is, I think, similar in other ultra-conservative right-wing populist movements in Europe. And I think it's more specific for the German case, or which is not necessarily the case in other countries, as far as I can see it, is first the close ties of right-wing gender policies to population policies, population politics. So, for instance, in the AfD, the family politics is closely connected to a seeming demographic catastrophe. So, where the shrinking German white population is linked to mass immigration, and therefore there should be a three-child policy in Germany. And the second interesting point, and we can also come back to it later, is the appropriation of feminist language, indeed. So when right-wing actors claim, if you think, for instance, about the mobilizations after the sexual attacks in Cologne in 2015, so right-wing actors claim to give voice to victims of sexual violence, they highlight the importance of women's self-determination, they highlight and stress the importance of the equality between men and women, and so on. So in the remaining time, I would like to make three short arguments, which may be interesting for discussing right-wing populism and ultra-conservative policies in Germany. First, and also in accordance with, I think, most of the speakers here, what is often overlooked that for the populist right and the ultra-conservative groups, so gender and family policies are not just one topic among other, like anti-EU topics or anti-immigration or climate change denial. So this is firstly reflected in the fact that almost every major mobilizations during the last year in Germany had been, by this populist right, had been on topics of gender and the family alike. So I already mentioned the Demo für alle against sexual diversity education, the mobilizations, the right-wing mobilizations after the sexual assaults in Cologne in 2015 and 16. But there were also, for instance, you can name really lots of examples. The Kandel ist überall mobilizations, the demonstrations, right-wing demonstrations after the murder of a 15-year-old by an unaccompanied minor refugee in December 2017, but also recent right-wing protests over COVID-19 policies. For instance, the Querdenker, the lateral thinkers, which are very present in Germany right now, they mobilize over the supposed harm that children have to suffer as a result of mandatory masks and vaccination, and also they mobilize over the fear that the state is interfering in the upbringing, in the private sphere, in the upbringing of one's own children. So this focus on gender and family of the right is no coincidence. So because especially in Germany and having in mind the German history of Nazi Germany, right-wing and ultra-conservative narratives alike, for these narratives, binary gender identities and the heterosexual marriage and family are the founding pillars of a society understood as anti-individualistic and strictly hierarchical. So this is a really important pillars of the worldview. And as you already mentioned, this is the same reason why these groups are against human rights, also children's rights, as like a liberal notion of the individual. So in this narrative, so complementary, unambiguous gender identities, such as the caring mother and the male breadwinner, they assign social positions, allocate responsibilities, resources, form of participations, so they have an ordering function. So these identities tell you who you are and show you your place in society and what you have to do. So, and in this hierarchical order. So if these identities are in danger, for instance, as a result of gender mainstreaming, again, a chiffre, then not only the family, but the society as a whole is in danger. So, or as Gabriele Kubi, one of the most active activists in ultra-conservative networks Europe-wide, puts it on demonstrations against sexual diversity education. Remember that, sexual diversity education, I quote her here. We are here to defend the foundations of our culture, the foundations of the family, the well-being of our children, and the future even of the whole society. So, and if this heteronormative family breaks away, quoting again, then the rootlessness of humans, the social anarchy is following. So, this is what Claire Hemmings calls affective fiction. So, effective politics which don't have to be true to be powerful. So this image of the threatened family and also the threatened German women, threatened because of this seemingly foreign perpetrators, they are used to construct a scenario in which nothing less than the cultural, biological reproduction of society is at stake. So, and this is a really powerful moment of the effective politics of the right. Secondly, these policies are often described as an attempt to re-traditionalize, and I also can connect what you told before, as an attempt to re-traditionalize and gender relations and to propagate seemingly seemingly long outdated gender roles. But I think this misses the point in part here. Just to remind us, after Cologne, in the right-wing mobilizations, in this right-wing narratives, it was the independent, boisterously celebrating, drinking women in public who had to be protected. In the case of the protests against sexual diversity education, it is the mother as a public figure and politicized subjects who is viciously fighting against the state interfering in upbringing her own children and so on. So there is a tension between, at the one hand, these traditional images of femininity, and on the other hand, indeed, a seeming emancipation and appropriation of feminist discourse, which is interesting here to my mind. So right-wing populist parties are not just Männerparteien, so voted for and led by men, but at least in Germany, they also articulate new female subject positions, such as the defensive mother. So instead of a re-traditionalization, I guess we should see that there is a genuine re-articulation of gendered subject positions and relations. So they offer, these parties, these networks and mobilizations, they offer specific mode of identification for white women. So you can call it role models for white women, for specific women, based on an image of reproductive yet always politically mobilized and emancipated, supposedly emancipated femininity, with the partly inclusion of feminist rhetoric. And the last point, just very short here, we have to be aware that anti-gender politics in Germany don't have to be reduced to specific groups or parties, but rather we are dealing here with a more broader right-wing discourse coalition, which reaches far into conservative and liberal, the liberal spectrum. So, but we can also see is that these ultra-conservative right-wing populist groups have also been quite successful to shift public discourse clearly to the right in the last years, as you can see in many examples we can maybe discuss on later. Like discourse on cancel culture is a very important example here.
Thank you, Katharina. And now our last guest, Elżbieta Korolczuk, who is a professor in sociology working at Södertörn University of Stockholm and at the American Studies Center in Warsaw. Poland is a key state in Europe to understand all this movement, all this group, but also the struggle of feminists against trying to limitate, to contrast this kind of movement. Your last book, you published a book 1 week ago called Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Moment, and you theorized that this anti-gender campaign that started in 2010 is not a simple continuation of anti-feminist backlash, but a new, completely new political configuration. Can you help us to understand what it means?
I will definitely try. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to the organizers. It's been very interesting and enlightening experience. And well, basically, I think we all wonder, why did the anti-gender mobilization become so big during this particular moment? Why? I mean, it has been for a long time. I mean, the Vatican has a long history, as we all know. So why now? So I will try to answer this question focusing on Poland, but I think that this example might be not parochial, but paradigmatic to many other countries. Because if we look at these wonderful ladies and gentlemen here, we realize that they have become well-known household names for homophobia, misogyny, anti-trans politics, and so on. But we also know that people such as Salvini were not always this cross-kissing, defenders of family. And in the Polish case also, Law and Justice was in power in 2005, 2007, and they didn't introduce any further restrictions on abortion. So there has been a change in their positions, and I would like to take a closer look at this process, because I don't think this is an inevitable happening, but rather a process. And I would like to take a closer look at the relationship between populism, and especially right-wing populism, and gender. When we look at literature, we have scholars such as Kasmuda and Rovira Kaldwasser, very well-known scholars in populism, who say that basically populism conceptually has no specific relationship to gender, right? Because there are elites and the people, so both groups are not gendered. And this is something that we should deeply disagree with, because we experience something very different. But there has been also scholars who look at the ways in which right-wing populism draws ideologically, for example, from gendered nationalism, because populism tends to be this kind of thin-centered ideology, so it takes on other more robust ideological projects. Yet others, such as Dietze and Roth, have shown how extreme right-wing forces, political forces, have been using gender, and especially family, the concept of traditional family, to sanitize their language, to make it more palatable, right? To say, well, we are not really racist, we are not really homophobes, we just want to protect the family, right? And also this is very much connected to Sara Farris have analyzed in terms of feminationalism. So the way to instrumentalize certain elements of feminist discourse, and this is what Katharina was talking about, to actually make it more widespread and popular. And yet others, such as Birgit Sauer, showed that this, well, right-wing populism can be read as a project of masculinist identity politics. So I would like to supplement some of those ideas and propose a notion of opportunistic synergy between anti-gender politics and or parties and right-wing and ultra-conservative, often religious fundamentalist organizations. And this is something that we came up with together with my friend and colleague Agnieszka Graf, and the book is downloadable, it's open access, so if you would like to take a look, you are certainly welcome. So in the Polish case, we could really see how this opportunistic synergy has been growing and why it has been growing. So there are basically three phases of anti-gender campaigns in Poland. The first one started around 2012, mostly around the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, sex education or anti-discriminatory education, and that was the moment where the gender ideology has become the bogus word which started to circulate around. And at this time, mostly fringe right-wing parties such as Solidarna Polska engaged in this kind of coalitions, and this lovely lady made quite a big career out of that. So the idea was that we have to protect children, we have to protect the family, but it was quite a fringe phenomenon, I would say, marginal in many ways. But around the 2015, that was the moment where a mainstream party, Law and Justice in this case, jumped on the bandwagon and said, well, we need to have some kind of threat to mobilize people to oppose those liberal elites. And at this moment, the threat of migration or refugee crisis, as it was called, became quite important. And that was the moment, and I guess this cover of a right-wing magazine sums up this narrative, which we know from many other countries, that we have to protect our white Polish women from those barbarians who are at our gates. But at the same time, the caption says, this is something that the media and Brussels elites hide from the people of the Union. So in the Polish case, it was not so much this femo-nationalist discourse of, you know, we are the beacon of gender equality and we have to protect that, but rather this gendered nationalist vision of we have to protect our nation. And right after the electoral victory of the Law and Justice Coalition, ultra-conservative organizations who have helped them in the electoral campaign said, well, this is payback time, so we have to introduce a blanket ban on abortion. But it didn't happen at that time because of the mass mobilization of Polish women, but it did happen in 2020 in October through much more complicated juridical path. And this is the moment where you can see how politicized homophobia and how politicized misogyny has become a template for a right-wing mainstream party, populist parties such as Law and Justice. And the Polish president in 2020 during the elections was quite vocal about, you know, the dangers of gender ideology, which at that time morphed into LGBT ideology. So there is this affective politics of right-wing populism that we can see at work in many countries. The constant need to have an enemy, the constant need to create fear and anger against the elites who are supposedly colonizing us with their foreign ideas. And that was the moment where you could see how the access to abortion has also been part of this agenda. And even though we had mass mobilization of Polish women and men, unfortunately, this decision of the Constitutional Tribunal could not be reversed. So how to make sense of those developments, how to conceptualize them? I would like to come back to this issue of opportunistic synergy, because this is a dynamic, this is a process which has both ideological discursive elements and also strategic and organizational, and it has a very strong affective dimension. So first of all, and we have been talking about this yesterday quite a lot, there is this process of secularization of the anti-gender discourse, which is accompanied by moralization of political divides. So basically, what the adoption of the anti-gender agenda has helped right-wing populists to do was to make this political division not only about, power, but about morality, about basically the fight between evil and good, right? And this is the moment where you have the enemization, if you will, of feminist and LGBT community. And basically this is the moment where you enter into the sphere of antagonistic politics, in which you don't have proponents or opponents of certain things. You have mortal enemies whom you have to eliminate from the public life. And at the same time, you can see how mainstream politicians are slowly adopting this very strong moral stance as their agenda. Then the second issue, which is equally important, is that the anti-gender discourse is basically quite effectively presenting opposition to gender as an opposition to neoliberalism as a socio-cultural formation. And this is something that has been discussed yesterday a little bit, but this is the moment where I disagree with Nancy Fraser, because I think that actually what has happened in Europe, and you don't see it in the US, for example, or Brazil, is that these parties, such as Law and Justice in Poland or Fidesz in Hungary, they managed to connect the cultural with the material and economic. So they are not only talking about, that they are opposing the alienation, the rampant individualism, the myth of the family and the community. They are also proposing chauvinist welfare policies to actually alleviate some of the effects of the neoliberal transformation. So this leaves basically feminist and left-wing politicians or forces in a very precarious position, because there is already someone who have taken over as theirs critiques of neoliberalism. Although, of course, they don't use the notion of neoliberalism, they would talk about rampant individualism and so on. And they quite effectively positioned feminists and LGBTQ activists as the agents of neoliberalism. And to conclude, then of course we have the situation where they are using the anti-colonial frame quite effectively, and this is something which has to do with the East-West division. So they are basically saying we in the East, but this also connects to the global South generally, right? We have been colonized by the West, and now we come back as those who will save you, basically. We will save you from the outrages of sexual revolution, of the outrages of neoliberalism. We will be the ones who will save the Europe and its Christian core, right? And finally, this is also a process of elite change, because in Poland we can see, and also we can see it in other countries, in Italy especially, the process of institutionalization of the anti-gender movement within state structures. So now they are operating not only from the outside, but also from the inside state institutions. And this is, I would say, quite ambitious and long-term projects. So, for example, now in Poland, Ordo Iuris have established its own higher education institution, Collegium Intermarium. The idea is that they will create a new cadres for not only Polish institutions, but also European Union institutions, because they will teach, for example, law and with the specialization of human rights. So this is something that is a very ambitious project, and we should not underestimate its effects. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I have a lot of questions I would like to address, and a lot of issues that rise up. First of all, my question is how the pandemic has affected this kind of movement. The point is that the public opinion was focused on the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, and my feeling is that the strength of this networking was a little bit hit by the pandemic, but they are still working locally. How they are organizing their work locally. And also during that big Congress, World Congress of Families in Verona, it was very clear that there were a financial networking, and every journalist, every news magazine was trying to understand who was giving the money, where the money came from. Can you help us to understand a little bit more what is the financial network which is supporting this kind of groups worldwide? Massimo.
I go. Okay. About the financial aspects, I think we can refer to Neil's data's report, Tip of the Iceberg, Anti-Gender Actors in Europe, because there are a lot of information which are, we know, very difficult to find and to discover because they hide them very well. And but I would like to mention, also always related to the World Congress of Families, one organization at least, which is the Citizen Go. You might know, because Citizen Go and a person in particular, which is quite related to Citizen Go, Luca Volonté, were critical to organize this mobilization in Europe and especially in Italy. So I'm focused on this view. Citizen Go were founded in 2013 by Ignacio Arzuaga, and the interesting thing is in the Citizen Go board of trustees there is Ignacio Arzuaga, of course, and amongst others Luca Volonté, I will talk about it, Brian Brown, who is the president of the World Congress of Families, and Alexei Komov, a Central Russian K person. So Citizen Go had a crucial role in training activists. They organized several meetings from 2013-14 onwards to train activists to understand, to learn how to do anti-gender activism, how to speak the language of liberal democracy, how to reply to the protests of feminists and LGBTQI+ activists during their protest of against the bus of freedom. Maybe you know, it was in Germany also, this demonstration of the bus of freedom against the sexualization of children in school and so on. So Citizen Go, in my view, had a critical role in mobilizing people and train people and to share knowledge and information, and also to share and to circulate money to organize a campaign. Okay, if you have to organize a campaign with the posters and a bus traveling in a country, you need a lot of money, so they provided this. And to conclude, just one word on Luca Volonté, because he is a key person in Europe, in Italy. If you don't know him, Luca Volonté has been between 1996 and 2013 an Italian MP, and between January and July 2013 he was the chairman of the popular group at the Assembly of the Council of Europe. And from there, he got in touch with La Manif pour tous in Paris, and also when he met the young Catholics, amongst other, Jacopo Cogge, the bearded man you saw on the slide before, in Rome, who wanted to organize something. They wanted to do in Italy the same thing French activists were doing in France. Luca Volonté helped them to meet Ludivine de la Rochère in Paris, and she allowed Italians to use their logo and their name, so they created in Italy in 2013 La Manif pour tous Italy. And so they started to use the resources of the transnational activism to implement in Italy a new path of ultra-conservative activism. And I very agree with you. It's something new. It's not the pro-life movement, the traditional pro-life who is changing, is adapting. It's a new generation of activists. They are very young, and they are tired of the religious engagement in the society, in the political arena, because it doesn't work anymore. So they want to do more. They want to be effective, and they want to engage in the city, as I would say the Pope Benedict XVI, Ratzinger, have described and have shown the horizon in the 90s, at the end of the latest century. He saw that you have to start engage in the political and the public arena as Catholics, but also as citizens. You have to stop to wait for bishops to enter in the arena. You have to do it by yourself, because it's your responsibility as Catholics. In the new world that speaks about LGBT rights, gender equality, there is actually, it's something new. LGBT rights in Italy before the 80s, 90s, we didn't know that. It was not an issue. So.
Thank you. Massimo,
yeah, I think the first question about the financiation of such groups, there are, I can only refer to some very interesting studies and texts about other people, like for instance Andreas Kemper, Alexander Häusler, and Dieter Blewe from the WZB in Berlin. They have written about the international networks, also where the German ultra-conservatives can be contextualized and financialized. I can really recommend this text. You find them online. They also write about, very important in the case of the AfD and Beatrix von Storch, of course, are also the aristocracy networks, the European aristocracy, and the funding in this way. On the question about the recent mobilization and the impact of COVID-19 on these policies, I think interestingly, it didn't really change this policy, but on the contrary, it really, it even furthered some demands. So during these mobilizations, I already mentioned the protests on the COVID-19 policies. Some of the basic or some of the main arguments of this anti-gender policies have been picked up, for instance, in this figure that the state is interfering in one's own private, as the most private sphere in the upbringing of one's own children. And when looking, of course, we do have an election campaign in Germany right now, and when looking at the recent mobilizations and the recent policies of the AfD, what changed during this election campaign maybe, then I think it's just several really short points here. I think it's interesting that the chapter, if you look at the party programs from the last years of the AfD, you see that the chapter on family and gender, it's mostly in family, chapter on family policies, where also gender issues are dealt with, that this chapter is getting longer and longer. Yeah, so it's it also the demands became more detailed, so they invest in this policy somehow because they realize it pays off somehow. It is really successfully mobilizing. You can see that the influence of ultra-conservative groups in these policies is even stronger. So, for instance, we talked about it yesterday evening, but there's very prominently the notion of the Lufthoheit over Kinderbetten, Lufthoheit über Kinderbetten, so the air sovereignty over children's beds, which is a key notion of, you found it in the election program of the AfD, which is a signature notion of Birgit Kelle, also one of the most prominent figures in German and European ultra-conservative networks. Also, you have like, it's interesting how current contestations are being picked up. So you find that in the chapter about sexual diversity education, it's not only about that children should be free from gender education, but also from climate hysteria, as they call it. So children, so the idea that gender and climate issues are some kind of inauthentic, disturbing, the process of the real, authentic, and like a secure upbringing of children. And again, like really, and this is really getting stronger and stronger, the appropriation of feminist discourse, as I already told you. So if you have a look on the campaign film on gender policies of the AfD, so it really starts, it literally starts with, okay, women now have a double burden between job and family, and they also have to adhere to absurd beauty norms. Then you have the issue of date rape, drugs, and sexualized violence. And then you have, so okay, you have the danger of gender and gender mainstreaming, who is like unsettling women, and the AfD stands for a society where women are allowed to live their life according to their real, authentic sex. So, and even like a strong wording is that the AfD supports and wants to have strong women so that they can be able to live according to their true sex. So in the German case, it's really important to differentiate between anti-feminism and anti-genderism. So it's not only anti-feminism in this case, but it's really strongly, it's anti-genderism. So I think this is important too, when looking at the recent.
Thank you, Katharina. Elżbieta?
Very shortly about COVID, I think the outcome is ambiguous because on the one hand, focus on the dangers of disease have moved away the issue of gender from the agenda and weakened right-wing populist parties in some countries. But at the same time, in other countries where they are already established, it enabled moving with certain policy proposals and programs under closed doors, behind the closed doors, right? So the idea was that in the Polish case, for example, there was a very limited possibility to get to know what's going on with certain projects. And then because protests were illegal, there was, I mean, this protest took place anyway, but there was a lot of police harassment, a lot of violence against the protesters. And that makes the very act of engagement in protesting in social movements much more costly. When it comes to the money and financing, I would point to two issues as well. One is and this is about Citizen Go. This is not a phenomenon restricted to ultra-conservative organizations. We have a process of restructuring within the civil society organizations worldwide of the ways in which they seek financing. And those .orgs or open platforms such as Avas or Move On or 38 Degrees in Germany, they have this new model of using new technologies, social media, I mean, not so new maybe, such as social media, to mobilize people around petitions and to be financed by small donations from activists. And this is exactly what the ultra-conservative part is doing as well. And that means also that you can see how in countries where they are quite strong, such as Poland, these countries become not the receivers of foreign funds, but also the hubs for financing other countries. And this is a very interesting case with a French TFP and a Polish counterpart, Stowarzyszenie Piotra Skargi. And we know that only because they entered into a legal proceedings with their, well, they're like franchise, right? They're establishing organization in another country, and then this organization gives money to the mother organization. And the Polish organization said, like, oh, we are paying too much. And according to the news coverage, There was around 8 million euro during the last couple of years transferred from Poland to France. So you could see how the hubs of financing are changes because they're using quite effectively various ways of securing funds.
Thank you, thank you. I have a lot of questions, but our time is finished. I think that it's the moment we can open the mic and gather some questions from the audience. If you have some question, you can address. There is one question over there.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the panel. I just wanted to go back to one of the issues that Elżbieta actually raised, having to do with the relationship between populism and anti-genderism, because it seems to me that there is an important difference between cases such as Poland or Volonté, etc., and cases such as populist parties in the Netherlands, or even Marine Le Pen, who appeared among our heroes here today. If you look at how Marine Le Pen mobilizes issues of gender, both when it comes to abortion rights, she's not anti-abortion in effect. She is the one who suffered the consequences of taking a rather liberal position within her party. Her father went to trial for homophobic remarks, but she actually enlisted a lot of gay men in her high ranks. And apparently she's very popular among gay voters, certain kind of gay voters, right-wing, etc. So what I think is important in these cases is that Marine Le Pen is an example of mobilizing gender language, and not just language and rhetoric, because in effect it is more than that, but in a very specific way, because she always downplays the political essence of gender issues. She depoliticizes gender issues, so she needs a very, a nicely tamed gay community to work with, but it is not the same thing as, just the kind of volonté issue. The second remark that I don't know if you agree with me on this one, the second remark that I wanted to make is that there is one particular strategy that I don't think has been brought up, and volonté is a wonderful example, which is the victimization of Christians and Catholics specifically. This is something that has been extremely active, especially in Europe, in bringing up, and maybe you have thoughts about that too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, definitely. These strategies are very flexible, and clearly in countries where gender equality and the rights of sexual minorities are very much established within the political discourse, the parties that we are talking about are much more able to fine-tune their message. So they would be adopting much more this kind of femo-nationalistic or homo-nationalistic discourses. And also they would be much more careful with elements such as anti-Semitism, for example, which in the Polish context and some other context is much more visible than it is. But the interesting part is that if you look more closely what is going on, what they are, for example, voting for and so on, and Sweden is such an interesting case, right, where you have a very strong norm of gender equality, where you cannot openly be a homophobe in the public debates because it would cost you a lot. But if you look at the Sverigedemokraterna, what they are doing is actually supporting a lot of political solutions that would effectively limit access to abortion, for example. Right? Through conscious clause, through other issues, through small changes in the healthcare system. So I would say that we should really look at the differences, but also sort of look behind the scenes and look what they're doing. Because in the case of Sweden, it's quite interesting when the spokesperson of the Eszter said openly that politicians should have a closer look and monitor and control what's going on in areas of academic life, such as gender studies and critical race studies, of course. And he got a lot of criticism for that. So he sort of downplayed this and started to use a much more moderate language. But if you look at the type of connections that they are making and the type of organizations that they are cooperating with, you can see the very same people being behind that. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the Polish is the extreme case, obviously, for many reasons, but we should not underestimate the type of political projects which are being very subtly proposed in other countries where these issues cannot be openly expressed within the political system. So that's my stance.
Thank you. Katharina, Massimo, do you want to ask something?
Maybe there is a...
There is some other question? Please.
Again, my question is basically, is this, where do we go from here? This feels inevitable, that the only time that in human civilization things get turned around is when people finally say, okay, that's too much. And as a lifelong, human rights person, I see that it takes an outsider to come in and say, hey, you've done this is very, very bad, but it's happening everywhere. So what's the outsider? What's the system that comes in? How do we stop these people from having this influence, and why is there not a counter voice rising up at the same point? And, I know, we have a lot of money and a lot of resources, but it always feels like the left always is allowed to be splintered by the right. They find some reason why, well, you're a feminist, but you're the wrong kind of feminist. You're a human rights activist, but you're focused on, this section, and I'm focused on this section. We can't talk. It's always very much that Life of Brian scenario, and I'm just wondering, what can we do? Is there any data on what we can do to pull together and to stop that, splintering, or at least, stop the misinformation on social media from being the dominant voice of the world right now? Because otherwise, it feels like just let it run its course and pick up the pieces afterwards is the only option to keep your sanity.
Are there any other questions? Thank you. Are there any other? Asia?
So I think that one of the most, because I have two questions, but I will do maybe just one for now, but I think that one of the most interesting aspects of this movement is the capacity to appropriate of progressive language. So I saw, for example, on the website of the Polish organization Ordo Iuris that in this 8th March, they have organized a conference addressing women's rights. So my question is, how they frame it, and which kind, so what do women's rights mean for them, and what kind of practices they implement to protect them? Okay, yes, because maybe there is time for another.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe shortly, thank you. Just two things. I have shown the mobilization against the World Congress of Feminists, a very big mobilization of various kinds of actors, on the progressive actors, let's say. But it was in 2019, the anti-gender movements in Italy started, let's say, in concretely in 2013. So 6 years later, we had this big mobilization. But between 2013 and 2019, it was very difficult to let activists and parties of the left, progressive parties, to understand that something was happening in the right wing, in the radical right, in the ultra-conservative movements, and so on. That was something new, that was dangerous, that it was going to enter within the institutions. They were waiting for the elections in 2018, and they could make it because thanks to the Lega and thanks to the populist moment raising. So there are responsibilities of activism and political forces of having underestimated the danger of this movement. And in the meanwhile, they institutionalized their position in the political and the public, in the media also, they are now legitimate to participate to media debate as the defender of the family, like it was something very kind and very, very gentle. We are just defending the family, but we know that they are dangerous, and we know what they are doing. They are making abortion impossible. They are minimizing LGBT rights. So they are not. They are not for the ban on LGBT rights. They are okay. Let's do something, but not too much. Okay. So, and this has very concrete consequences on people, LGBT lives and women lives. So I don't know what we have to do, but I think that social movements, LGBT and feminist activists, and we are trying to do this, have to start to network at the transnational level, but also at the local level. And in Italy, for instance, it's not so easy to networking at the national level because Italy is very fragmented in regional and sometimes in very small context. So we have to network, and we have to make political forces, progressive forces, let's say, aware of the danger and aware of the fact that this discourse is not, it cannot be so legitimate. And so we have to say, we have to know them, and we have to react every time they speak. For instance, in the parliament in Italy, when Simone Pilon speaks about his family stuff, on the left, there are not so many people who know who he is, where he comes from, why he said these things, and what it means when he say the natural family and all the stuff he proposed. So we have to build networking, but also knowledge.
Also in Italy, it's very interesting now that, for example, feminists, there is an old tradition of anti-gender feminism, and now we have had a strong discussion among feminists about, for example, this new law called the DL Zan. And it's very interesting, I think, also to understand how the progressive movements, how the feminists, for example, are or are not understanding what these kind of ultra-conservative movements are. But please answer to our public, Katharina.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's really important. I think it should also be like, I think as far as I have understood it, this conference is also an attempt to give some answers to this question, very importantly. I think also like just very few bullet points, coalition building, it's all about coalition building, so we have to be aware that ultra-conservative policies is not just about special groups being put more in danger, but like it affects really broad, if these policies would come in power, it would affect like broad parts of the population. So also you mentioned it, I think it's a really important point to highlight and to stress that these policies, it's not about language, it's not about like, I don't know, non-discriminatory language, but it's also about a material side of it. So these policies, these networks, these parties, they understood that neoconservative and right-wing populist policy contains also a material side. So in the case of the AfD, for instance, and this is really highly contradictory, but on the one side they are against the welfare state. You can read it like we are against the welfare state, the nanny state, and so on. And on the other hand, on the family program, we see like really large reforms and really like demands which should like from where many people would profit from it, like in white families, of course, would profit from this policy. So we should be aware that we should also like formulate an alternative to this material side of right-wing populist policy. Then I think it's important to think what enabled these conservative and ultra-conservative groups in the first run to say that family and gender identities are something private and something natural. I think Judith Butler wrote a really interesting piece about it last 2 years ago. Judith Butler, of course, where she says that historically, if you look at liberalism, so it was always liberalism who told us that family is something private, that one's own identity is something private. So we should like formulate, or it should be an attempt to repoliticize sexual identities and to repoliticize the family, the private sphere. So just to say, this is private sphere, this is like the family, it plays in the hands of right-wing populist movements. So. And of course, it's also like important to mention what do we do with the appropriation of feminist discourse as feminists, as left-wing or progressive feminists. This is also a very important question. I think the answer could and should only be that to remind us about intersectional positions among feminists. So it's all about keeping in mind and pushing black feminism or demands of feminism of persons of color. And for instance, also when this conference is about reproductive rights, we should also keep in mind that it was like black feminists and feminists of color who insisted on the notion of reproductive justice, which is something different. So what are the social conditions for different women, who enable different women to become children and or not. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as the first question, I think we all think about it and try to answer it. I would say about 4 things. One is about the connection between the economic and cultural issues. And that's the key. And I have shown that the right has been doing it in a very skillful way. And I really think that we have to do better. And this is connected to men, basically. Because I think that without men on board, this project cannot succeed. And this is, in turn, connected to our vision of privilege, you know? And I think we have been trapped for a very long time in this vision of privilege as a position. So if you are a white man, heterosexual man, then you are in the position of power. But it is quite clear that a white heterosexual man who is homeless and without a job is, in relation to me, not in a privileged position, right? So privilege and discrimination is a relation, right? It's not a backpack that we get when we are born and then we just travel with it. And we need to really take stock of this fact and to think about relations as those that are structuring our life. And I don't think that, you know, making one group, in this case, white men, a boogeyman in this discourse, really helps us. Because first of all, it alienates us in terms of economic demands and working together. And it also doesn't really help us to understand how those processes are being played out in our actual life. And the 4th issue is the question of future, because I think that we have been cornered into the situation where we defend the past, right? We are like clinging, oh, we have managed to achieve something, we progressive, let's say, and we don't want to lose it. And historically, the left has been always the vanguard of the future. We have to reclaim the future. We have to reclaim the hope. We have to have this vision that what we are proposing is not just simply, you know, clinging to what we managed to do, but rather moving forward to the future that we want to achieve. So these 4 elements, I think, are very much integrated. And without them, it will be difficult to answer to this question. And very shortly, appropriation of women's, of gender feminist notions or discourse. I've been looking at that in details and analyzing that in the case of Ordo Iuris. And it was very interesting because especially with this 2020 proposal to ban abortion for embryopathological reasons, and the first one, the blanket ban on abortion. So they were trying to sell it as protection of women. You know, we know this, right? We have to protect women because they get depression after abortion and so on and so forth. But that was very much counterintuitive to the narratives of many women who experienced these issues in their own lives. So what the women's movement has done was to use lay knowledge, emotions, coming back to the very core values such as solidarity, such as dignity, such as the right to decide on your body, and root it in their experiences. And I think that this is something that feminism has started with, right? And then we traveled into this road of academic sophistication and, you know, terminology and so on. And it's fine. I mean, I'm an academic, so I have to be okay with that. But I think that we have lost this sense of connection with our emotions, with our experiences, with our lives, with our bodies. And I think that this is the best counter strategy to this appropriation. Because when it comes to this moment, they have no legitimacy. And people know it, and people feel it. And that's why thousands of Polish women went to the streets. They said, no, 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 we don't believe you. We don't believe your fake constructions. We believe ourselves, and our sisters. And this is something that I guess it's a way to fight this.
Thank you to Massimo Prearo, Katharina Ayak, Elżbieta Korolczuk. Thank you to the organizer and to all of you. Now there is a 15-minute break and then we will start again.
Hi. Good morning again. So, the panel titled Causes and Challenges of the Crisis, What is the Role of Progressive Liberal Movement, will take place now. Nina Horaczek couldn't come for personal reasons, and so the journalist Gezin Dornblut will moderate the panel. And we really thank you, her, for to have accepted our invitation. Thank you, Gezin. I welcome on the stage Judith and Gezin, because the other 3 speakers will participate online. And online we have the Professor Ilse Lenz, Eszter Kováts, and the Professor Sara Farris. Thank you.
So, hello again. I'm honored to open the last panel of this very interesting forum here in Frankfurt at Frankfurter Kunstverein. Yesterday and also today morning we have heard so many interesting facts about the ultra-conservative movement, about actors, about funding, about strategies, about achievements, about their weak points also. And we have touched a core point several times. If I put it into Asia Leofredi's words from yesterday, she said yesterday morning, we need to understand if our side failed. And this question has been present all the 2 days long, and the longer we discussed, the more intense we discussed about this question, about the role of the liberal and the progressive society, or part of the society. So finally, what is the role of progressive and liberal movements? This is the question we want to try to answer during this panel. And I welcome at first Judith Gertz here with us in Frankfurt. She is a philologist and political scientist at the University of Vienna. And she is also a member of the research group Ideologies and Politics of Inequality, and also of the research network Women and Right-Wing Extremism. Welcome, Judith. And unfortunately, most of us are only online available, but nevertheless, a warm welcome. Eszter Kováts, she is a PhD candidate in political science at Goethe University of Budapest. She did empirical studies on Hungary, and also from 2012 till 2019 she worked at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, which is the German foundation close to the Social Democrats. She worked at the Hungarian office and led the gender program for East Central Europe. Welcome, Eszter. Also, we have on the screen Sara Farris. She is a professor in sociology at Goldsmiths University of London, and she is an author of many works on gender, migration, social reproduction theories, nationalism, racism, and Marxism, and so on. Welcome. And last but not least, Dr. Ilse Lenz, Professor Emeritus of Sociology with a focus on gender and social structure research at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum. Welcome. So we agreed a few rules that you are already familiar with. We have at the beginning short presentations. This time it's 4 presentations, each 7 or 8 minutes. If you talk longer, I will get angry. And later we will have a discussion here on the podium, and of course, as always, you are invited at the end also to ask your questions. So I would like to ask Eszter Kováts to begin. She proposes a critical understanding of the conservative backlash against women's and LGBT rights, because Eszter says instead of solely conservative resistance to progressive change, the anti-gender actors propose, albeit ugly, answers to real and partly problematic developments on the left. Seeing these root causes behind the worrying political developments might help develop more effective counter strategies. And please, Eszter, I'm curious, if you could explain this to us.
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm really honored by this invitation, and I found the last 2 days really there was a lot of content, and I would like to join with my contribution to those speakers who tried to address what enabled these movements, how Nancy Fraser put it. So basically moving beyond the surface, moving beyond an analysis of their strategies, their networks, and looking at society, and also looking critically and self-critically on progressive liberal movements and policies to better understand why the right-wing messages can resonate, what is the fertile soil for the messages. So that is what I am interested in, and I come from Hungary. Most of my empirical studies refer to Hungary, but I hope that some of the things I say go beyond the Hungarian context. Also, I am not very big fan of framing these movements as conservative backlash for many reasons, but one of them is what Asya said yesterday in her introductory remarks, that this how good we are and how bad they are. So basically framing it as a conservative backlash, it is a very normative and a very comfortable moral position that we are the good ones on the right side of history, and they attack us unjustly. And I believe it might be helpful politically in certain contexts, but analytically this doesn't bring us much further. So I would like to use my short time to present some of my considerations of the last years. I published on them too, but just very briefly on the elements of the progressive politics in gender, sexual reproductive health and rights, LGBT, women's rights, which might add to those points that were raised already in the past 2 days on possible causes. One of them, the first of them is that human rights, LGBT feminist causes are embedded in global inequalities, and within Europe, it's also embedded in intra-European inequalities. What I mean by that if someone talks about human rights from a power position, then those who are in a lower power position might perceive it as an arrogance and as an attack against the own values. And we can see it there is a lot of studies about how, for instance, LGBT rights have become a shield or a way to express who are the less educated and the less Europeans within the European Union. This can cause very strong resistance, or how John Steiker formulated it, that for international relations, that the human rights shaming is a strategy that can backfire, and this is what is backfiring in the case of Hungary, because the right-wing government is very much weaponizing this thing that we are oppressed, and they want to tell us how to live and join us to resist Brussels and resist the West. And the problem is with this, that it is their strategy responds in a way to really existing economic, symbolic, epistemic inequalities, which are expressed also in feminism and in LGBT rights. My second point is the human rights consensus. So not without reasons, there is a big agreement on progressive side that human rights are unquestionable, uncontestable. Every person should be respected for that. But it has become in the last years as a strategy to upgrade political claims to human rights. And as soon as something is a human right, it is unquestionable. And then if somebody questions them, then that person is against human rights. So now we can see in many questions, things like right to a child, right to sex, right to determine your own gender, and the list can be continued. And everybody who questions any of these is called anti-human rights, and the labels are very easily given out in the progressive spectrum: sexist, homophobic, transphobic, populist, fascist. Recently, some days ago, Judith Butler said in an interview that somebody who questions that there are more than two sexes is a fascist. And I believe this is a discursive strategy on the progressive side to rule out dissent. And as Chantal Mouffe said already in the beginning of the 2000s, basically she predicted the populist surge because she said about the neoliberal consensus back then that if the center right and center left doesn't allow discussion about things, and many things are just sidelined, saying that there is a consensus about that and it's not up for debate. If there is this consensus and it's not legitimate to discuss questions, then it can foster antagonistic resistance. So I believe, and a second point is to open up more this place and also ask ourselves self-critically, what is a human right, what can be still debated, it should be a human right, and what we do with dissent, so as not to enable further antagonistic resistance. The third one is what haven't been discussed yet on this conference, and I know it is very tricky, but the concept of gender itself, which I believe if in this room we would ask how you define the word gender, we would get as many answers as we are here. So there is an ambiguity of the concept of gender, and of course it's nothing new. But it's not only in gender studies, but it's in politics and in activism too. And I believe there is also a shift in the recent years from more structural understandings towards an individualistic understanding. So instead of talking about the ascribed roles to males and females and the hierarchical structures, patriarchal structures, or heteronormative structures, we very much more talk about gender as something someone identifies with. And this individualistic, monologistic, and voluntaristic view of gender, so that only I know my gender, is one of the things what the right wing capitalizes on. And I think this is also something what we should discuss more. And the fourth and last point I would like to mention is the discussion about positionalities, which, you know, this idea that delegitimizing the idea of an objective universalistic truth and that there are position knowledges made also the very much value-based human rights cause more fragile, and because everybody else can also say that this is not, it is not coming from our culture. This is what the Hungarian government is constantly doing, saying that this is our understanding of democracy, this is our interpretation of European values, and from our specific Hungarian positionality, this means this and that, and you shouldn't question that. So I believe that this positionality thinking, which was always used to empower the marginalized knowledges and positions, can and is now used also by the right wing. So I'm wondering if we can do without some universalistic, value-based claims against this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Eszter. This was just in time. Thank you very much for this clear introduction. And the next speaker is Sara Farris. She will talk about the phenomenon that right-wing parties resort to women's rights, and she will demonstrate that the concept of populism is unable to help us to analyze the reasons why this is so. Please, Sara.
Hi everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me. And again, sorry, apology that I cannot be there in person. Because I don't have much time, yeah, we'll also try to be a little bit schematic and just to go quite straight to the points I wanted to make. I mean, the first point, I guess, as I also wrote in the abstract, is that I think the concept of populism, as I also wrote in my book on femonationalism, is a quite vague concept. This is the essence, if you want, of my argument. Is a vague concept because it's been used in the last 10 or so years to describe both right-wing and left-wing political forces. And it's been used also in some ways in order to make sense of how certain right-wing political forces are using women's rights or even gay and LGBTQ rights in order to depict Muslim communities or migrant communities as backward. This is one of the reasons why many political commentators in the last 10 years have said this is not classical fascism. You couldn't find this centrality of women within fascist movements, or certainly you couldn't find any mention or any openness to gay rights within ultra-conservative and fascist movements. So we have something new in front of our eyes. Now, I contest this idea. Although, of course, some of these movements might not have their roots in fascism, that is certainly true. But nonetheless, I contest this idea because in many ways it's wrong. These parties, in fact, are foregrounding gender, are foregrounding women, and they are doing in a way that actually is quite common within nationalist movements. If you look even at fascist discourses, women were always central. The point is, what kind of centrality do they have? And what I try to say is that that's the centrality that is given because of female body functions. Women are the biological reproducers of the nation and the cultural reproducers of the nation according to nationalist ideologies. So if we actually dig into these histories, if we look at the role of nationalism and nationalist ideologies during fascism, during colonialism, we can see very well that nationalism is the fundamental matrix of this movement. And in that sense, it is not that strange the way in which they foreground women. We have to understand, though, in what ways, what kind of women do they foreground? What is the role of women that they foreground? This brings me to my second point. One of the reasons why I believe the category of populism sometimes can be a little bit, I mean, as I said, disorienting and vague is because it's not understanding the role of class. And I think this is also one of the issues that we have to really discuss if we want to understand the future of progressive movements. For instance, if I think want to really analyze the rise of the right wing in Germany or in the UK, as well as across in other countries, I think it's really important that we try to grasp with the reasons why right-wing parties have managed to portray themselves as the champions of the white working class. So the mobilization of feminist themes has been central to the strength of the right wing, as I said, because these political forces have used an old colonial trope, that of the foreign male as a sexual predator ready to assault white women, to conflate images of sexual threat and economic threat that clearly play with the xenophobic imageries and fears of impoverished communities. But I think that class is also central to the discourse of the right wing, of the nationalist right wing, because I think it is also important to understand why the idea, the representation of Muslim women or non-Western women, migrant women, as victims that need to be saved, which has been a very strong discourse of the right. Why has this discourse been so instinctively understandable to so many people in Europe? And in my view, part of the reason why, you know, in a way, even Europeans, I mean, people who would vote these right-wing parties, why would they be even ready to make an exception for migrant women and to say, we don't want the men, but we can see why the women need to be saved from these backward cultures, backward and misogynist men, etc. I think is also because, which is one of the arguments I put forward in my work, because migrant women, including Muslim women, have become essential to our care economies. They, as you know, are now especially employed in the care industry as nannies, as babysitters, nurses, carers for the elderly, and so on and so forth. And I think that if there is something that this pandemic has taught everyone, is that care work is absolutely essential to our survival. We have also seen how many migrants, how many migrant women, foreign women, women from ethnic minorities are working in these sectors. This brings me to the second point, which is a very difficult question. How can we, which is the question of this panel, what can progressive movements do? And for instance, what can specifically the feminist movement do to, how can we save feminism from these toxic entanglements with right-wing nationalist parties? How can we detoxify, or if you want, decolonize feminism, as some authors have said, and really, in a way, really put forward the idea that was very powerful in Audre Lorde, which is really promote feminism as a movement which is a unity in difference, that leaves differences not as a threat, but as a form of empowerment. And this is clearly the most difficult question, to which there is not an easy answer. And there is not an easy answer, I think, also because it is an issue that needs to be answered on the battleground. We cannot answer it in a room. It needs to be answered in the opportunities that movements are given to show solidarity, empathy, political support, to form alliances, and to go beyond the differences when there is a common goal. Now, in some ways, I think we have reasons to not to be too optimistic, as somebody already said throughout this conference, particularly the way in which feminism in gender issues are increasingly instrumentalized by right-wing nationalists, but also co-opted by neoliberal forces, as in the powerful image of the lean-in white woman. But I think I would also like to say, I think also we have reasons to hope. And let me give you two very short examples. Now, 2-3 years ago, in the midst of the Me Too movement, many commentators pointed out that Me Too was eminently a celebrity white women movement, and that the issue had gained such traction only when these prominent women, these famous actresses and celebrities, etc., had raised the problem in certain industries. But on that occasion, I also remember how many working class women organized in trade unions came out in support of Me Too, to say, we can relate to your experience because it is what we experience every day in our workplaces. We support your struggle because that is also our struggle. And if your prominent positions help make a change and make our own political battles easier, then it is welcome. The second very short example, in the last, again, 3 years, of course, the pandemic has put an halt to it, but I think it's still significant to remember the importance of the international feminist movement in the last years, the international women's strike, the explosion of a new feminist movement in Latin America with Ni Una Menos, or in India with mass demonstrations against sexual violence, or in Poland. So we, I think, have seen the emergence of a new feminist movement, which at least in some countries, in some ways, has embraced more and more anti-racism, but also anti-capitalism as a class politics in explicit ways. So to conclude, I guess what gives me hope is that it is not only feminism as a vague idea of gender equality that is now mainstream, but I think it is also anti-racism and in many ways also anti-capitalism that is more clearly the common denominator of these new movements. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sara. I liked your answer, the way you put it, your question, how can we detoxify feminism? And I think this question is good in order to introduce Judith, because she proposes something. She will talk about femicides in Austria, and femicides, this is an issue that was instrumentalized by the rightists because, of course, only then if the perpetrator has a migration background. And there is a new movement in Austria that tries to make femicides public and to politicize it. So please, Judith, your floor.
I prepared the PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if we can see it. Ah, yeah, perfect. Okay, then hello and a very warm welcome also from my side, and thanks for organizing this really interesting conference. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as already mentioned, I will talk about the politicization of feminicides and feminist and anti-racist strategies against the ethnization of patriarchal violence. And, sorry. As you might remember, topics such as sexual violence have been overused by the extreme right in the recent years. We can see it in some campaigns of the identitarians, but also after feminicides took place, for example, in Kandel, or the sexual harassments in the New Year's Eve in Cologne. And on the other side, many left-wing groups neglected the same issues or reduced their analysis to exposing the extreme right's rhetoric as racism. In particular, debates about legitimate criticism of the Islam or the handling of the instrumentalization of gender politics by the extreme right have led to inner-left separations and conflicts. Racism and sexism were often played off against each other, or sexual violence was played down or overemphasized. While some liberal and left-wing groups spread racist thought patterns under the guise of enlightenment and emancipation, in other parts of the liberal movements, a counter-culturalization of anti-racism, as Massimo Perinelli calls it, could be observed. But even slogans such as "our feminism is anti-racist" or "our feminism is intersectional" remained mostly empty phrases that could not provide answers to the fundamental challenges of the debates. Questions like how misogyny and patriarchal violence could be addressed without reproducing racist argumentation remained largely unanswered. It was easier to concentrate on the enemy, the extreme right and their racism. So for a long time, the few critical feminist voices that addressed, for example, the global commonalities of patriarchal violence remained unheard. Liberal groups and also left groups not only failed to respond adequately to these right-wing instrumentalizations, they also understood the related issues far too little as their own. And if groups that take up the cause today had consequently done so for the past few decades, it would not have been so easy for the extreme right to occupy these topics in their interest. Just as the extreme right only dedicates itself to sexual violence when it can derive racist benefits from it, the left only reacts when right-wing groups take up the topic. As a result, in both cases, and here I quote Goetz, sexual misconduct committed by marginal others serves as the starting point of the different mobilizations. Furthermore, right-wing groups could fill these existing blanks with their own gender and thereby anchor their demands in mainstream political discourses and normalize them as legitimate positions. And in contrast to these developments, in July 2020 in Austria, a movement called Claim the Space was founded
that set itself the task of politicizing patriarchal violence and its extremist intensifications, feminicides. It follows on from the feminist movement, Ni Una Menos, which was already mentioned, which originated in Latin America and which managed to develop really powerful movements there. And just as a brief explanation why I'm talking about feminicides, the term femicide describes, as a distinction from the gender-neutral term homicide, murders of women, lesbian, inter, non-binary, and trans people because of their gender, their sexual identity, or also their gender identity. And most of these murders are committed by people close to them, such as partners, ex-partners, or other family members. The term feminicide, on the other hand, encompasses the gender-specific component of murders of women, lesbians, inter, non-binary, and trans persons who die as a result of state violence or a failure of state. For example, due to illegal or illegalized abortions or lack of protection from patriarchal violence. So since July 2020, no feminicide in Austria has been left uncommented. Instead, spontaneous demonstration, until now more than 25, have been organized every single time a feminicide became known through the media. The last rally took place on Thursday, and over 1,000 people joined this rally. And not only the above average number of feminicides in Austria, also the attacks by Turkish fascists on the demonstration organized by feminists against feminicides had given the impetus to bring this issue into the limelight public and into the streets. And these rallies not only serve to remember and commemorate those who were murdered, as well as those affected by patriarchal violence, they are also intended to make the systematics of this violence visible. It is a principal aim to show that these murders are not individual acts, but have a system and must be understood as an expression of ongoing patriarchal structures. The exploitation and oppression of women, lesbian, inter, non-binary, and trans people is an integral part of a capitalist and patriarchal society, and its maintenance is ensured by the same kind of patriarchal violence that goes hand in hand with male claims to property and dominance behavior. Every single feminicide is cruel in its own way and makes clear that patriarchal violence often does not stop at words but results in violence of deeds. This violent social constitution of society cannot be encountered exclusively by demands such as those for more protection against violence or place of refuge for affected women. What is needed is a more fundamental change and an end to a system that is inevitably producing patriarchal violence again and again. And actually, with these mobilizations, we can also see first successes. For example, the criticism is increasingly being taken into account in media reporting, and journalists refrain from trivializing wordings such as jealousy drama or murder out of love. And instead, the murders are clearly designated as femicides. The constant work also has increased social and general awareness of the topic. More and more people are joining the rallies against patriarchal violence, so that at times, several hundred people took part in the spontaneous demonstrations. And also in other cities apart from Vienna, such as Graz, Linz, or Salzburg, demonstrations against feminicides are being organized. And I think the most important thing about this politicization of feminicides is that it means to find a collective practice, that it makes it possible to overcome a purely reactive moment and thus gain agency. And in the course of this politicization, also important feminist debates were initiated, from the entanglements with other ideologies of inequality in capitalism to the question which improvements would be possible under the auspices of current conditions of exploitation and to whom the corresponding demands could be addressed. And by answering to every single feminicide, regardless of the respective origin stories of their perpetrators, it is also possible to refer to the central commonalities of patriarchal violence and destructive constructions of masculinity across the globe, to counteract ethnization and to expose the selective right-wing extrementalizations as racist. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Before I give the floor to Ilse Lenz, I would allow myself one short question. You mentioned the rallies and protest rallies. Who are the participants? Because we are talking about the need to reach out and to build coalitions and so on. Who are they?
Yeah, actually, the last rally that took place on Thursday was quite interesting in this respect, because I don't know if you heard that at the moment there's a delegation from Chiapas in Austria, namely 200 Zapatistas, and so the women from the Zapatista movement joined our rally with about 50 people from them. But since the two women that had been murdered on Monday have Somalian origin, there were about 100 people from the Somalian community in Austria also taking place in the rally. And apart from that, it's mainly feminist organizations, but also more and more people who hear from these rallies in the media or especially on social media are joining the demonstrations, because I think since also the awareness has become greater in the last year, more and more people are really scared by these developments, that Austria is a country where so many women are murdered every year, and that also the government doesn't have much responses apart from punishing the perpetrators. And I think for this reason, it's a lot of different people who are actually taking part in these demonstrations at the moment, reaching from migrant communities until students who heard about it in social media channels.
Thanks. So, last but not least, Ilse Lenz. You wrote in your abstract that it's not enough and even helpless to only criticize and attack the mistakes or hate language of anti-feminism. You demand that progressive movements have to become more reflexive. So please, what do you mean? You have 7 to 8 minutes.
Thank you very much for having me in this beautiful, inspiring conference, and also for this interesting panel. What I will say resonates with a lot of things which have been said before, but now I will try to, I have to show my PowerPoint and I'm not able to do that. Could you please let me show my PowerPoint?
We will check. Wait a minute. There is something done now.
Yep.
The colleagues are working on it.
Because time is so short, it's easier to develop this with the PowerPoint.
Yeah, don't worry. Just a second. I think we will see it.
I think you have to make her a co-host.
Not happening.
We are still working on it.
Yes. Oh, great, it worked. Okay. Can you see it?
We
yet.
see a black screen.
Yes.
Yeah. Now you can go.
Yeah. So I'm going to make three remarks on gender conflicts and feminist futures. For me, this is a very strange anniversary. 10 years ago, I wrote my first article about anti-feminism, which was one of the first ones in Germany. And at that time, people said, oh, the men are getting angry at feminism because they lose so much. And I said, no. I read what they wrote about me in the social media, and I thought this is a conflict. And I'm now first going to introduce this concept of gender conflict and hoping to say a little bit why it is useful. Now, in sociology, as sociologists, we have a long history of analyzing conflicts. And Georg Simmel already said persons are brought into a relationship to each other by having a conflict. And in this case, it's a gender conflict. The actors on both sides are motivated to contest for what they see as their gender interests, but also as gender justice. And many of you have already said we have to understand the motivation, this ultra-right morality, and I agree with that. So appealing to suppress the so-called sin of homosexuality or to see women only as mothers is an idea of gender justice, which many, and also I guess most of us, do not agree with. But we also have to see that this is also their idea of justice. And the basic conflict is about the coming new gender order. Gender norms, gender practices are being challenged, and we don't know yet what will happen in the future. It's not about the return to the past, but about an either neo-patriarchal or a more maybe just future. And I agree very much with Neil Datta in that. So the conflict is about the future of gender in the coming transformation. It is important to recognize this moral motive on gender justice on both sides. And it has already been said, and I think this is very important, that the ultra-religious, ultra-right critique of feminism is directed towards the effects of neoliberalism and also progressive neoliberalism. And that they promise security, not only by economic means as money for mothers and things like that, but also by propagation of the breadwinner, husband and housewife model. Now, the second side of conflict sociology is to say we have two visible partners in a conflict, the two contestants, ultra-right and neoliberal anti-feminism and gender movements, free gender movements, but there also is a third party. And so this conflict relationship brings three groups together. The two contestants trying to reach out to the third party, namely the public, the media, politics, and organizations. And Georg Simmel was very clear in that. He says it is a struggle and a wooing of the third party. And I think in feminism, often we look at our internal conflicts, we look who is right, who should be included or excluded, but we do not very often, or we too little, relate to these issues in gender and sexuality, which concern many, many people, and I think we overlook the class movement and also the race moment in that. Now, reaching out for a resonant in the third party, so-called, will not succeed by appeal to interests only. This is important, to appeal to interests, but this must also be based on concepts of gender justice, which appeal to a diverse public, not this idea of gender as biological one role, but to recognize diversity and have an intersectional perspective. And also it must be argued in a democratic way, appealing to everyday needs and experiences. And I was very much moved by Judith's presentation, which I think showed just how this has been done in this vital issue of the right to live for women. Now, the third point is, therefore, I think we should also watch, of course, ultra-right and neoliberal anti-feminists. But if it's about the future, we also need visions and projects for good lives for all genders. This is an abbreviation, but you know, I hope what I mean. Ultra-right movements, in my view, had limited success with gender. They had dramatic success with gendered racism. When they talk about the threat of so-called men from other places and so on, they have a big voice. If they talk about abolishing sexual autonomy, the voice is not heard very much. There was a study of a Pegida demonstration, and 60% of the demonstrators said, we are against gender. But 60% or even more even also said, we are for sexual autonomy and the right for abortion. So I think sexual equality in the third party is rather a widespread value. So feminism can use their reflexive potential to be critical of their own reductionisms and tunnel visions. They should develop visions and projects for good lives for all genders based on intersectional gender justice in the polity. I'm sorry, in this short time, I can only put this so generally, but I think Judith gave us a brilliant example. Now, the classical arguments in feminism, in liberal feminism, of individual autonomy, and also the argument nobody should be excluded, no sexual group and so on, is basic for feminism, but it is also limited. And neoliberalism and imperial states, as in homo-nationalism, have tried to co-opt that. Therefore, I think we have to reflect on our values and not stop with autonomy. Well, with short association, I would say core values should be combined, like autonomy, the recognition of equality and difference, something which you can call horizontal and reciprocal sociality. This was so important in the COVID pandemic, to know that there are friends who will go shopping for you if you fall ill and are put into quarantine, who will take care of your children, or your queer partner will stick with you. So if the whole attack is about family, I don't think everybody has to use the word of family, but issue, who will live with you, who will support you, and whom you want to care for, is really very important. And also to aim for just institutions like gender just childcare places, school, workplaces, hospitals, and so on. And the fourth value is what I would like to call reflexive universalism. Eszter alluded to that. There have to be some general values which all sides respect and which may not be instrumentalized. Now, the old universalism started from Europe. Judith gave us a very good example of reflexive universalism. Thinking about yourself, your position in international systems of domination. She said that they took up this idea of ni una menos from Argentina and then tried how to translate it to Vienna. And I think that's such an interesting development. So if we look for visions, also I have one short example. There was a conference on sexual autonomy and reproductive autonomy and the right to abortion. And Ulrike Lemke did a very moving presentation where she said, we have to see this as an issue of health and well-being, like having a health system which provides support for pregnant persons and persons giving birth and fathers. We do not have enough midwives in the town of Berlin where I'm living. It's a complete scandal. You don't know what will happen if you go to give birth in a hospital. Also for abortions and counseling for, of course, voluntarily trans persons who want to have that.
sorry to interrupt you. Could you please come to an end because
I'm at my last point.
Okay.
I think feminism have to show why gender is a useful, necessary category for a just society, why it should be intersectionally, and how it contributes to gender democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. One question to you is, you said concepts and aims must be argued in a democratic way. May I understand this demand as a sort of criticism? Would you say that so far this is not the case? And could you
but I think we can learn a lot about, how do you call that? Ethics of negotiation and exchange. Like Habermas tried to develop an ethics of communication. So if, for example, a person is being, a feminist is being attacked for being racist, I think we cannot just say that, but we have to say, how do you base this argument? Why is it racism? Not to personalize, but to say, if we have racism and feminism, where are the values which support this racism? And we have to enter into a dialogue. So very often from this position of exclusion, there is some kind of critique, which then does not start a dialogue, but rather a new split. And I think we have to be able to translate this into a more general discussion, which also appeals not only to splits inside feminism, but also to the issues in what I call the third party, the other very diverse people living in this society. I do not mean to trivialize the critique of racism. Please don't misunderstand me.
Okay.
I mentioned this spontaneously. For me, this is one of the most difficult issues. And I think the critique of racism has been so important, but we also have to learn how to handle this in a way which is, well, let's say, gender democratic. So to find maybe more easily, everybody has a right for a voice, and people come together, moved because they have common emotions and interests and values. And we should respect this and try to say why, for example, attacking gender as an unnatural category is against the values of women's and human rights, and also against the interests of women and for the neo-patriarchal elites. I
think we got this point. Actually, I prepared questions, but I saw you taking notes, Eszter, and Sara also, I saw you taking notes and listening very carefully. And as we had such a broad spectrum of different inputs, I think it might be interesting just if, or I would like to know if you would like to comment on something, if you have questions to one another, instead of me asking questions. So it's, I have also questions, but please, Eszter, would you like to comment, to criticize, to add?
I would rather, I can comment on what connects. I think what we have been saying, I mean, I very much like Judith's contribution, because hers was the intervention that said there are failures on the progressive side, and this is that the violence against women is not taken seriously enough, even with progressive causes, or is somehow very difficult to address certain parts of violence against women, and then this is what the right wing is using. I really like the reflexive universalism concept of Ilse. I want to use it from now on, because I think it is a very interesting, it is a good approach in my view to solve this contradiction of positionalities and universal values. And I think we all highlighted the importance of class, which is very much downplayed in my view. And also, if I may, one more critical point is in intersectionality and how it is used in today's activism. Very often it's just one identity category among others. and not like, you know, someone from a worse economic position and how that person has different interests than others, and somehow disembedded from a critical of capitalism. And also to the care work, I think Sara Speck was also dealing with this yesterday, saying that in a certain way, the right wing is giving certain answers to the crisis of care work, and which something which is not seen enough in progressive movements, at least in the parties. It's not a critic towards feminism, but also this care migration thing. And this is why I think class and economic or global inequalities have to be taken together in a more systematical intersectional analysis, is to see that last year when we were faced with COVID and saw how care work is so essential and how care work is carried out in among such unequal circumstances, like migrant women being so disadvantaged, that I was living in Germany then, and it was at the same time talking about elderly care carried out by Eastern Europeans, the asparagus, so all this agriculture, and who will collect the vegetables and the fruits for the middle classes, German middle classes who don't do this work among these working circumstances, and the meat industry. So so again, it's not only about the essentiality of care work, but the essentiality of much of the work, what our life is based on, and the very bad working circumstances and low pays in Germany are very, very widespread in these sectors. And Eastern Europeans I exploited, I cannot use a more polite word, in these fields. And then when Germany criticizes Hungarians for not being enlightened enough, we must understand that these messages come in this context of so many Eastern Europeans who flee from their very bad circumstances from home and have a little bit better here, but still feel as a second-class citizen. And very often also in the intersectional activism in the West, the migration question is also, and the racism question is reduced to people from the global South, but the East is forgotten from the equation. And I think if we are in Europe, we need to add this dimension too.
I think I hope all of you listened to the lecture by Nancy Fraser yesterday, and I wanted to pick up one point she made. She said one of the, she said what unites ultra-conservatives is the hatred towards educated progressive elites. And she said, if we only defend those hated people, it will only play into the hands of the ultra-conservatives. And instead, she suggested two things. And one thing is to build coalitions, to try to split working class people from the Trump side and unite them with lower class people from the Democrats, what means overcome the polarization. And also on the previous panel, you talked about the need to build coalitions. Sara, in your abstract, you also said that using populism as a model means to reduce processes to us, the people, against them, corrupt elites or migrants. What do you suggest instead? And do you think concrete, would it work to build coalitions, and with whom? What's your idea about it?
This is such a, I think I completely agree with Nancy Fraser. It is the most important task that progressive movements have at the moment. As I said also in my brief intervention, to overcome, to try to find that unity in difference, to acknowledge our differences, but to try to work with that difference and be focused and concentrated on the goal, what unites progressive movements rather than what divides us, because obviously different sections of the progressive movement have different interests, have different identities, goals, etc. But what is unifying? This is the most important goal, but is also the most difficult one, because for for so many reasons. I can see that I could see that throughout my activist life. It was constantly the most difficult thing to do, to try to keep unity, to try to work, with that difference. It is now that, as you might know, British universities are facing huge challenges. We are constantly threatened with redundancies, with our colleagues in the administrators, so even the non-academics even more are threatened with redundancies. And what we are experiencing now is precisely the difficulty at bringing these different groups together, academics, non-academic, students. And I'm just speaking about the small world, but obviously there are many other examples that have been made. We know this is an endemic issue within the feminist movement, when we have constantly discussions about who, in a way, I think sometimes also within feminism, there has been a certain proprietorial, if you want, attitude in some ways, that who has the claim to the better feminism. And there are so many, obviously, issues that we have to face. I think, though, at the same time, really, it is, I think, really important, and I'm speaking especially about the feminist movement, but also with this centrality given to class, to foreground the issue of care, as Eszter was saying. One issue that I don't see, I think, really emphasized enough is the issue of care and social reproduction. And by this, I mean, obviously, lots of feminists now, lots of movements are talking about care. As it's been said, the pandemic has put care back on the agenda because it is so obvious that we so much are interdependent human beings. We depend on each other. We badly depend on care and carers. But what does it mean to foreground the care? I think that one of the huge issues that we have really is to promote the rights, the economic rights, the social rights of carers. They are amongst the worst paid category of workers in our countries. Not surprisingly, so many migrants do these jobs. They are really this reserve army of labor that's been used in Europe, many of them from Eastern Europe, as Eszter was saying. And I think it's really important to foreground the absolute huge issue of care in terms of workers' rights, but also in terms of, for instance, the rights for families, universal care.
Thank you very much. I would like to open the floor already to the public. Are there any questions, please, to everybody? Yes. So there must be a microphone. Just a second.
Thank you so much for these great speeches, great presentations. And I have two questions. One is to Judith, and I really love your presentation. I was just wondering, who are the people behind this new movement? Is it something that the already existing organization started, or is it something totally new, which is inspired by this new mobilization in many countries, including Poland, Argentina, and so on? So it's very interesting for me. Another question I have to Sara Farris about the usability of the concept of populism, because you said that populism is not the best concept to capture the question of class. And I beg to disagree with that, because historically, if you look at the development of populist parties and movements, the class was the main and defining feature. If you think about the populist party in the US in the 19th century, their claims were about, worker security, 8-hour day, working day, and so on and so forth. And this element is very much included in this us versus them definition, although, as Margaret Canavan has shown, populism is not only opposition to the current redistribution, unjust redistribution of power and economic resources, but also to what is seen as dominant culture, right? And while we have this restructuring of the political field towards culture, the issue of economics becomes buried, not only within the populist parties, but also in the public political debates in general. So I would like to ask you, why do you think that gendered nationalism would be more useful concept for capturing the question of class?
Thank you. So Judith, would you like to answer first?
Yeah. The whole mobilization process started after last year, a demonstration which has been organized by Kurdish and Turkish groups, and which also tried to protest against femicides in Turkey. And this mobilization got attacked by Turkish fascists. And before these attacks, I think there was very little knowledge about that they quite frequently did these rather small rallies. And after these attacks by Turkish fascists, more and more feminist groups kind of wanted to make something against it. And so organized groups came together, ranging from these Kurdish Turkish organizations, but also, for example, Austria, which was already an existing group, and also Austrian feminist groups. And they started this whole process. And actually every 8th of a month, there's an open public meeting where interested people can join. And so I would say it's really a movement that tries to be as low level as possible and accessible for a lot of different people. I mean, of course, the channels of communication are usually reduced to social media channels, so of course it's difficult to reach people who don't use these channels at all, for example. But I think that also in the situation of Corona, for example, when new people moved to Vienna, started to study at university and did not have any access to political organization or to getting to know other people that might be interested in similar topics, it was a very easy way for them to get connected to a movement. And of course, it's very different. There are some rallies where a lot of people come, and then there are others where we're only 200 people standing there. But this also has to do with media coverage and how people hear about the femicides, and sometimes, I have to admit that as well, also the cruelty of the femicides. Of course, if there's more shocking events, then more people go on the street. And when, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
So, Sara, the question about the better concepts, and may I ask you to be short, because we have more questions from the internet.
Yes, I'll be, as short as possible. I didn't mean to say that populism does not have a class dimension. Of course, I agree. If you look at the origins of the movement, I think you were referring at the People's Party in the late 19th century in the United States, or the Narodniki movement in Russia. Of course, they had a strong class dimension, which was the people were the farmers. It was an agrarian movement, and it was a left-wing agrarian movement. What I was referring to was the usage of the concept of populism, particularly in the last 10, even 20 years in many ways, and the ways in which populism has become such a vague concept that's been used not so much to foreground the class interests of political formations, but in order more to speak about the political style of these movements. So usually you think of populism as the identification of the people of the party with a charismatic leader, or as those political parties that manage to dichotomize the political space, to split the political space into the us versus them. And in fact, now when we think about populism, so many parties are called populists. Even left-wing parties are now called populists, right-wing parties are called populists. My point is not that we shouldn't use the word or the concept populism. I think, though, when we talk about populism, populism, in my view, can represent or describe a political style, but does not describe the ideology of a party, at least of contemporary movements. And the reason is, as I said, because when we look specifically at the ideologies of these parties, they are squarely nationalist in the case of right-wing parties. That is more my point.
Thank you. So please, the questions from the internet first.
Well, it's less a question than a comment. It's a person who says it's Sara Nabil from Afghanistan, an artist and activist who joined the conference because the person is dealing with exactly the topic of the conference, really appreciates the program and would like to take the chance to share something from the other side of the world, saying that probably all of you know the takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan means that women are suffering and are currently in a very bad situation. All the rights are taken away, and the request of the person is to stand with these women.
Thank you very much, and yeah, greetings from Frankfurt and our solidarity. That's all we can, I think, express now from this podium. There was another question. Susanna, right? Wait for the microphone, please.
Yeah, I have a question for Eszter. Concerning your point about the consensus on human rights, one thing that occurred to me is that one of the critiques that we should bear in mind is an important one that comes from, from different segments of civil society against the human rights movement, is that the human rights movement seems to be privileging minorities. So when it comes, for example, to social rights, the human rights movement is pretty much absent. And I think this is an intriguing question because, in effect, as a lawyer myself, we have this way of thinking that rights are in the first place minoritarian because majorities have other means to satisfy their needs. But especially in times of economic crisis, this might not actually be a particularly fruitful way of thinking. So I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Yes, I agree with you completely that this is basically the missing class aspect in progressive movements addressed in the language of rights. I remember that the biggest protests against Orban's regime, Orban has been on power in Hungary for 11 years, and the biggest protests all over the country were against the slave law. So the law which allowed the employers to order 400 supplementary hours to be paid in 2 or 3 years. It was a very huge cut in social rights of employees. And if I compare the international reaction to this law and the international interest in these protests compared to the current pedophilia law, which is also very outrageous, mixing up pedophilia with homosexuality and transgender. So I don't agree with that law. But in the public perception, there is this what gains attention, what makes people angry, and social rights seem to be not only on the sidelines of progressive movements, but also of EU politicians. So it seems that it is perfectly fitting European values to exploit the workers. It is within the neoliberal framework of the European Union. And although I don't want to play this easy game of like class over identities or social rights over other types of rights, but certainly there is some sort of tendency in this way, what to notice and how to speak about that. I am very critical towards this very new fashionable concept of classism, the critique of classism, which is gaining traction in Western European and North American countries. So addressing poverty and the experience of poverty and on the level of discrimination, not as a critique of capitalist structures that reproduce these positions, but only the critique of how people who are in those positions are being treated and not nicely enough and in a discriminatory way, which is bad enough, but it doesn't go to the core of the issue. So I absolutely believe that social rights need to be better united to the other human rights causes.
Thank you very much, Eszter, and thank you to all of you for your participation in this panel. It was the last one, and now, because it's the end of the whole thing here, the whole forum, I want to hand over the microphone, or you have it already in your hands, to Franziska Nori from Frankfurter Kunstverein.
So these were 2 challenging days taking place in an institution devoted to contemporary art. And so I pay tribute to all of the experts that have given and raised their voice, allowing us to make things visible that maybe are hidden under a certain surface. And I think we are all together in this, that there's action needed, and that before we take action in our individual landscape, situation, contexts, we need to find a common ground about language, about which direction we foresee for the future of our very complex historical moment and very complex national and international societies. And as we heard from all of you participants, there's so many issues at stake. We've heard who are the actors, who are people behind the political streams. We saw the importance of being aware of legal issues, but also about the economical flows that kind of are able to trace international power streams. And in the end, I think it's about hierarchies, and it's about the question about power. Who has the power about our common future? So, like art, it is something that we would like to encourage to embrace all our differences and experiences, and then to find a way to find images, find a vocabulary, and find common topics, and not stay and stick in our own individual fields of expertise, because I think now more than ever it's needed that we find at least common points where we agree on for our political future and general future. But said that, I need to pay tribute also to the great effort and to also the visionary work of Asia Leofredi, who has made a parcours on 7 different panels with 7 different approaches, allowing us to really go in depth of the individual theses and knowledges. I want to thank all of you having come from all over, from different countries, and for most of us, it has been the first conference in presence. So we see the relevance of having real bodies in real spaces, speaking up our opinions and sharing our knowledge to contribute to make a change. And last but not least, thanks also to the city of Frankfurt, who has allowed this all to happen here at Frankfurter Kunstverein, because also that 1 week before, in Germany at least, we have national elections. It's a small sign that contributes to also a political standing of where we all are at right now. So thanks again. I hope we see you again soon. And yeah, thanks for all. Bye-bye.